Well, a very warm welcome to everybody, and you may get a surprise because the bad news is that Sally isn't with us. She's on holiday. The very good news is that Ellen is guesting in her place. Ellen is in Walworth in South London, and she also oversees Pembroke House, which is part of the Walworth Empire, south of the river. And for those of you who don't know, there are two parts of the city in which I sit. One is called London, and one is called South London. And South London has the ecclesial name of Southwark. So even though Ellen is probably only about 3 miles from where I'm sitting, she is in a foreign country. But Ellen has a distinguished reputation in preaching and also in parish ministry. And I wonder, Ellen, if you could sort of introduce yourselves, because despite you are world famous, but mostly in countries that probably won't be participating in today's dialogue. So perhaps you could say a little bit about your context and your background in preaching.
Well, thank you, Sam. It's really lovely to be here and an honour to be Sally's holiday cover. As you say, I'm probably about 3 miles from you, south of the river, the big divide in our city, and in what does feel like another world, really. My church is on a very big council estate. We were founded as a mission church, so I have a church, St Christopher's Walworth, and a big amazing outreach charity called Pembroke House that does lots of work in our community. We're surrounded by complicated redevelopments, lots of social challenges, just a very kind of different environment to where you are in Trafalgar Square. Our church tradition is Anglo-Catholic. We are majority West African in the congregation, and we reflect that in some of our worship. So we have this wonderful combination of kind of bells and smells and traditional hymns and a cappella singing and drumming at various points in the liturgy. So it's a very joyful place. When I was training, I had the amazing opportunity to be an exchange student at Yale Divinity School, where they had some world famous teachers of preaching, homileticians, two in particular, Leonora Tubbs Tisdale and Thomas Troger, who were my mentors, really. And I just found that I've always loved preaching, and I really love helping other people think about preaching. So when I came back to the UK and was ordained, I sort of started teaching preaching as a kind of parallel ministry, and I've done so ever since, really. And I now teach in one of our colleges that trains people for ministry in the southeast of England. So that's me.
Yeah, it was St Augustine's, I believe, which is with which Sir Hart Edge is in partnership. So that needs to be highlighted. Well, let's get going on a warm welcome to people from all over the world and other planets that are joining us today. And we usually start, and we're going to start by saying what's been happening in the world. What's the context into which we're going to be preaching this weekend, those of us who are preaching, and bearing in mind we haven't met like this for 3 weeks. So all sorts of exciting and terrible things have been happening in the world. I wonder how you see things from your desk in grey, cloudy Walworth.
Well, I think Ukraine is, of course, still very high in people's minds, and the news just sort of seems to keep getting worse, really, and the stories coming out. And also the plight of refugees, people trying to leave. Certainly in this country, we've had where we haven't yet been able to welcome many refugees, even though there's a lot of will to do that. And so I think that is churning around for people, but also some of the fallout from that conflict, shortages and the kind of cost of living rising and energy prices, all sorts of things are beginning to impact on people's day-to-day lives. And certainly around here, where a lot of people are already facing impoverished circumstances and food poverty, it's really frightening to think about what the next year or so might look like. How does it feel your side of the river?
I think it feels like we had we had something called Brexit that you may have forgotten about, but it's been overlaid with the pandemic, and then it's been overlaid with Ukraine. And for all of those, there's a kind of story cycle by which the crisis becomes very immediately apparent, particularly the case of the last two. Um, and then there's a sort of impulse in the news media to say, well, okay, this story's run 2 weeks, let's move on to the next story. And you think, no, 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 this story's going to be with us for 10 years. I'm sorry, sunshine. Even if the Ukraine war ended now, the damage would be felt for at least 10 years. The displacement of peoples, the horrifying experiences people have been through, and the atrocities perpetrated. And the pandemic, likewise, is going to leave an awful long shadow. And I just think our whole imagination about story in our culture just isn't equipped to deal with a slow burning tragedy like that. And particularly if you look at Ukraine, it was really awful in the first couple of weeks, and we did a live broadcast for the BBC from here on the first Sunday after, which is kind of what we do. We did after the Nice terrorist incident about 6 years ago. We tend to do in response to major events, Nelson Mandela's death, that kind of thing. But it actually isn't that kind of an event. It can't be slotted into that kind of response to tragedy thing. It's worse now than it was then. The people that didn't have much food 10 weeks ago have got absolutely none now. It's that kind of, but can our imagination stay with it that long? If it isn't a thing where, the world community gets in and just biffs Putin aside and he learns his lesson, it's not that kind of a story. Mercifully, so far, it's not a Putin gets out his big weapons and nukes us all to smithereens. It's not that kind of a story. Plucky Ukrainians repel Putin. He learns the error of his ways and goes back to lick his wounds. It's not that kind of a story either. Or 44 million people leave Ukraine and let Putin have it to himself, and then the story becomes about those 44 million people, being part of the European population. It's not really that story either. So it defies. And I just look on the BBC News website, for example, and there's another story about Mariupol, and there's another story about people living in ghastly circumstances under some huge building. And it's just very difficult to find the compassion to read another story about another ghastly family, and the journalists try to break it down and personalize it and meet an individual who can speak English and can explain it in language we can relate to. But it just defies our ability to comprehend in our conventional story shape of happy times, crisis, dramatic intervention, painful unresolved tension, happy ending. If that's our default for what a story should look like, it just isn't that kind of a story. And we it's almost like, like children having a bedtime story saying, no, 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 you've got it wrong, mummy. That isn't how the story goes. But mummy's saying, I'm afraid on this occasion it is, sunshine. So just very aware of that, and the pressure. I suppose I've said on this in this conversation many times and reflected enormously for myself in the last 2 and a bit years. Look, the significance of story and of how we place ourselves in a story, how we place ourselves in the scriptural story, but also how we place ourselves in what we perceive to be the world stories. And the pandemic was supposed to be over, and we keep doubting whether or not it is and changing our mind about that. I find myself, whether I'm wearing a mask on the train or not, I change my mind, from one day to the next. And they're all about, am I about to get on a plane, or am I coughing in a way that disturbs the people next to me, or, and just all these different factors. So anyway, there are, plus the economics that you've mentioned about cost of living and energy and things. really cutting, and from our point of view at St Martin's, that's really damaging as far as our commercial activity is concerned. Massive bills that we weren't ready for. So yeah, it's a bit of a bleak outlook, really. It's so should we transfer from there to the Easter season, which is supposed to be the happy part? Um, my experience is, and I wonder if you could reflect on this, that most clergy I know are quite happy preaching in Lent. We're quite happy with a long, slow journey. We're happy with the disciplines and the habits and the almsgiving and the fasting and all of that and the temptation in the wilderness. But most of us have got one Easter sermon, and then once we preach that, presumably on Easter Sunday, we've then looked down the barrel of 6 more Sundays in Easter season. What do we do with that? And well, of course, most clergy then deal with it by going on holiday. So that's fine. But then we come back and it's Easter's still here, like Ukraine's still here. Any reflections on the fact that Easter is 50 days and Lent is only 40?
Yeah. Well, of course, first that's a great sign, isn't it, that we worship God who gives us longer to party than to be penitent. And I actually think maybe this could be the year I really get Easter preaching, and that's there's something that seems to have happened in our corner of the world, which is that and just to briefly go back to our the last part of our conversation, 2021 was really hard. I mean, we all knew 2020 was crazy, but 2021 I sort of thought last Easter we were beginning to come out of things, and actually we're only still just beginning to process how challenging it was. And I recognize that around the world, of course, the pandemic has had peaks and troughs in different ways and is still moving in different ways, but for us 2021 was a real slog, and people didn't come back. We in our church, we reopened for worship on Palm Sunday last year. People didn't really come back, and we're kind of too small to do. We don't have the resources to live stream and do online stuff as well, so it's just in-person stuff. Lent was really hard going. I know more people that had COVID in Lent, myself included, than I have at the whole pandemic. So it was exhausting and frustrating and kind of never ending. And then on Easter Day, people turned out to church like they have not done since February 2020. And this may not be true everywhere, but certainly around us, that does seem to have happened for a number of people. They've kind of made Easter Sunday the effort that they've actually gone in person to an act of worship. And I looked out on Easter Sunday morning and I wept in my introduction, because I just couldn't believe what it was like to have a church that was full and joyful, and that it was the first time in 3 years we could sing Alleluia together on Easter Sunday. We don't have a choir, so we didn't get to sing until last August in a church where congregational singing is very important. So I feel like I actually experienced the resurrection in a completely new way this year. Of course, the numbers have crashed right back down again since then, but that sort of doesn't matter, because I kind of had this sense of hope, and the people in church, especially those who have slogged it out for the last year, also thought, oh my gosh, actually maybe Christ is risen after all. Maybe we do have a church. Maybe there's hope and there's a future for us. And I think in the Easter season, we have this great gift of readings from Acts throughout the season, which is of course the building of the church and the great mission of the church. And it feels like, I thought that was what we were going to be doing last Easter, but we were just still hanging on in there. This Easter, now we're about that, how is God using us? How do we rebuild this church? How do we, go out in mission? What does that mean for all of us? And this Sunday is, in this country anyway, this Sunday is Vocation Sunday, which speaks into both the vocation of the church, but also all of the horrible stuff that we've talked about. The vocation of the church is God's love letter to the world. That's us. We're part of God's plan, God's mission. But also, I think in the States, it's generally known as Good Shepherd Sunday as well. So that's just about this Sunday. But for me, the whole of Easter is right, here we are. What does it mean for us to be the church? Let's build back up again. So I'm actually more excited about this Eastertide in preaching than I have been in previous years. I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
I think it's also Mother's Day in the States, second Sunday in May, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly from my years in North Carolina. Um, no, I think I really resonate with a lot of what you've been saying, Ellen. I do think I remember preaching a sermon once on Easter Day called "The Discipline of Joy" because I'm a big fan. I didn't used to be, but after I went to the States, I became a big fan of giving titles to sermons, and it also helps you remember them. Um, and there is a discipline of joy, I think, for Christians, and and part of that discipline is in the preacher's imagination as they, to use an old expression from the news, as they go through the main points again, a bit like in that bit of 1 Corinthians 15 that we sometimes use as a creed during the Easter season. You know, he did die, he did rise again, he did appear to to the disciples. These are all tenets of our faith, and they need repeating. Okay, well, one of the strange things about the lectionary is in this time of year is we don't have an Old Testament lesson. So my questions for you are: do you miss it? And why don't we? And what Old Testament lesson would we have if we did have an Old Testament? I mean, what's that all about? Why do we start with the Acts reading in the lectionary? Any reflections on all of that?
Well, I love preaching on the Old Testament, and so I think just personally, because I try and make a habit of it more throughout the rest of the year, I don't miss it because I get excited about Acts actually. But I think it's really interesting to think about what we would what we would what we would what we would do instead. Um, I mean, maybe there's more to it. I mean, I don't quite know how that decision was made, because you could easily have Acts as the constant New Testament lesson and have an Old Testament one as well. But for me, the Acts, moving from Easter through to Pentecost and the story of the early church, although of course it comes in a slightly funny order for us in Eastertide, is just makes so much sense. But yeah, I guess there's no reason we have another New Testament and not an Old Testament. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, Acts is such an interesting book, isn't it? Because it's not a gospel, even though it's narrative in the way that the gospels are. And it's not an epistle, even though it's about the early church in the way that the epistles are. And it's certainly not the book of Revelation. So it is a unique book, but it's to me the thing I constantly come back to, and I've just published a book about apologetics, which I'll mention later because I need to do a little promo for it at the end. But in reflecting on apologetics and disputes about the Christian faith, one of the old chestnuts that comes up because somebody went to a seminar in about 1967, and where somebody said that Jesus never thought he was anything special, but Paul came along and invented this idea that he was the Son of God, and that's an old chestnut. But what you find when you read the Gospels and Acts is that the people who wrote the Gospels and Acts knew all these so-called fantastic original theories that are put about, and so Acts is almost all the issues the church has faced in the last 2,000 years are there in the book of Acts, and they're not all resolved, but they're mostly there. People misusing the message to create their own sort of empire and use Jesus as a means to that, and people getting so carried away in the Holy Spirit that they forget the historical rooting in the incarnation. It's all there. So I agree. I think the way I don't know exactly how the Revised Common Lectionary was put together, but I do think the opportunity to reflect on the church as a fruit of the resurrection, is the theme of this period. And you made some very strong claims about the church just now, which I think are really quite unfashionable, because I think even the Christians tend to be still very happy with Jesus, but somewhat sheepish about the church. And when I wrote this book, Humbler Faith, A Bigger God, it was originally entitled Humbler Church, Bigger God, and the publisher persuaded me that nobody wanted to read a book that had church in the title. So we changed it to Humbler Faith, Bigger God. And that just illustrates the same point, really, that people were very interested to talk about faith, but not at all interested to talk about the church. But, Acts, it does talk about the church. So why don't we get going? We've had a request to talk about Psalm 23, so we will create space to do that. But let's take things in the order in which they tend to come. So let's look at the Acts passage set for this weekend, shall we? And Tabitha, Dorcas. It's always good to have more than one name.
It is.
What do you make of a passage like this when you see it in front of you, and do you think my congregation are longing to hear the details about Tabitha stroke Dorcas?
I love this reading so much, and it's so lovely to hear in the chat from Kate Ellis from Brig, because I was a curate in Scunthorpe, and we had stained glass window of this reading in St Lawrence's Church, if you want to go and see it, Kate. And it is so visual, because so much of Acts is about the great heroes, St Peter, St Paul, and particularly if we're thinking with a sort of vocations lens. We often think about vocation and people's calling in terms of ministry and leadership and preachers and priests and evangelists. And here we've got this woman who's died, who's done this very practical, hands-on caring for the community. And I just love this image of these grieving widows coming up to St Peter, coming in to kind of save the day and do his first resurrection from the dead, literally shoving in his face these clothes that this woman has made, saying, look, these are the clothes she made for us. This is how important she is, and how desperately sad that she's died. And it just to me, it just speaks so powerfully of the vocations of the whole church, and how vocation is also about the people that do the practical stuff, the building stuff, the clothing people, the food bank distribution, the feeding people. And we've had some big stories in the last couple of weeks in Acts. The conversion of St Paul, and now we, as well as obviously this amazing resurrection story, it's about this woman who was sowing for Jesus and sowing for the church community. So yeah, I get very excited about preaching this story from that kind of perspective.
So say a bit about how you would. I mean, you've talked vividly about how you recognize the earthiness of this story. Look what she's done for us, and that making garments and things is a central act of upholding the church in that context. So what? I mean, this is a story about raising someone from the dead. Are we going to get ourselves angst-ridden about, did it really happen? Are we going to get literary about what's going on in this part of Acts compared to what's just been going on with Stephen and conversion of Paul? How much work would you do with the text there, and how much are you stepping away from the text to the kind of things you were saying about the place of, for so many different kind of people in the church, and the practical acts of service being as significant as the witness of the word?
I think I probably keep it. I don't tend to get so bogged down in the questions of, did it actually happen? How did it happen? Because, for me, the story is more powerful than that, and what Acts is trying to teach us, I think, especially on a Sunday like Vocation Sunday, when I'm trying to encourage everybody in my church to rally round and bring whatever gifts that they have. And so maybe that's a coward's answer, but I let the story carry us, and yeah, what do you, I'd be very interested to
Well,
know.
let's pursue that one because you've made the point a couple of times, and I think it's really helpful. Although I'm afraid I was ignorant of it before this conversation, that it's Vocation Sunday this weekend. Um, can you just sort of tighten the connections between this passage? You've talked about the ordinariness of Dorcas stroke Tabitha, um, uh, and Russell's just written in and talked about it as a contrasting story to the crash bang of the conversion of St Paul. Vocation's a slippery word, isn't it? It can be a way of saying we want more clergy, but we prefer not to pay them if that's okay. Um, it can be a way, in a sort of Lutheran way, of talking about the goodness of our earthly callings, and that being a bus driver is very important. And, we can get into that kind of conversation. We can get into a baptism conversation about saying, vocation really is rooted in baptism and begins there, and so on. We have a baptism at St Martin's this weekend, and so I'm going to be going a bit more in that direction. Or we can get into the disruptive part of vocation that says it actually isn't the Lutheran thing. It isn't about affirming what your gifts are. It's about taking you out of those to things you never knew you could do and never would have done without the Holy Spirit, which is more kind of what's going on in Acts. So could you sort of work your way around those four or any others that are in your imagination?
Yeah, well, I think I would tend to start with and I think where I'm heading on Sunday is not least because I have my annual church meeting straight after this Sunday service.
Good for you.
Um, that we I would start with baptism, and that vocation, all of us, every baptism changes the shape of the body of Christ, and all of us have gifts to bring, but also I don't necessarily see a contra I guess there is a contrast, but I don't necessarily see a conflict between the people who bring the gifts that they know that they're good at and they're comfortable with, because we need those people. If someone can do buildings, then please just step on up and help me with the damp. But also that we are also called beyond our comfort zones, like the Peters and the Pauls, to go and do extraordinary things. Um, Both of those for me are expressions of the life of the baptized, and the exciting thing is we don't quite know how God is going to use us with our different, the gifts that we've been given, and have developed, and the gifts that the Spirit gives, and the calling to follow Jesus, where that leads. So I would go for an amalgamation of the second,
Yeah.
the final.
I tend to, in my book Incarnational Ministry, I have a chapter I talk about the three categories that I find helpful, which are self, skills, and spirit. So self is the just showing up. Skills are the I'm an accountant at work, so I'll be the church treasurer. And spirit is, I've never chaired anything before. I thought chairing was something that carpenters did by making chairs, and you want me to tell people when to speak and when to shut up? Well, I could try that. I certainly do it with my family. If the Holy Spirit endows me with gifts, I'll give it a go. And the dynamism in church life is in that third category. The bread and butter is in the first category of just showing up and serving coffee and handing books out and so on. The danger, in my experience, is in the second area, where the accountant thinks that being a church treasurer is the same as being a company accountant and doesn't make the transitions, that actually some of the calculations involved in the kingdom of God aren't the same as corporate governance. So that tends to be the way I've configured. And if people wanted to read about that, it's in Incarnational Ministry. But there was also, I think, a Gift Sunday sermon I preached at St Martin's 2 or 3 years ago called Self, Skills and Spirit. People could find that on the St Martin's website. Okay, shall we move on to Psalm 23? People are gagging for Psalm 23, so there's always more to say on that. I must say I have, as I think one person pointed out, preached a couple of sermons on this in the last month or so. So I think I'm spoken out on Psalm 23. I did something for the hymns A&M Canterbury, preaching in Perilous Times event quite recently. I think it was the 9th of April, about Ukraine on Psalm 23, and also for the induction of the new Nazareth companions at St Martin's in Holy Week. So I think those documents are probably available in different. One would be on the Canterbury website, and one would be on the St Martin's website, I think. So I haven't got much to add to those. There's a lot to say, but do give us your highlights reel for Psalm 23.
Well, it's one of those readings that so many of us know so well. It can be, therefore, the hardest to preach on, because we almost, and actually for people to hear in church, because we almost don't hear it because we know it so well. And so for me, one of the things that's been very helpful has been the godly play material, because the Good Shepherd story, which is one that I happen to have known the best, recreates it very vividly about being the Good Shepherd who leads us into fresh, green, tasty pastures, and by cool, quiet, fresh waters, and leads us through dark and dangerous places and back out the other side. So that's been quite helpful for me to just sort of spiritually re-engage with it. And it occurred to me that this Sunday probably most of us are going to be singing hymns about sheep and shepherds. And aside from the obvious ones, one of the things I found helpful is the hymn "Father, Hear the Prayer We Offer," which took me years to realise was a reflection on this psalm. But it's quite not an ironic reflection, that's the wrong term, but it's quite a sort of feisty reflection on the psalm, because of course it's, well, not forever in green pastures do we want to stay, and not forever by still waters do we want to stay, but we want, the strength to go up the steep and rugged pathway, and we're going to smite the living fountain. And there's a real kind of sense of fight. This isn't an easy pastoral psalm, and especially given all that we've talked about, having a kind of fightier version, getting ready for battle and climbing that mountain that is ahead of us all, might be a more helpful way in.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's wonderful. I do think that there are a few things more rewarding than preaching on a passage people think they know well, and unearthing A, things they had never seen, and B, mistakes that we've all made in, whether it's hopefully not a wrong translation, but on passing over things or taking the hymn version as being the same as the original. All of those things, I'd never really thought seriously about "Father, Hear the Prayer We Offer." That's fantastic. New angle onto things. When I talked about the psalm in the Ukraine sermon a month ago, I did quite a lot of reflection, very much along the lines of the Barmen Declaration in 1934 about Hitler, from Bonhoeffer and Barth, about "The Lord is my shepherd." Not "the Lord is my shepherd," but "the Lord is my shepherd," i.e. Putin is not my shepherd, Hitler is not my shepherd. And this cult, I think, that we're revisiting at the moment, Viktor Orban, the guy in Turkey whose name I can't remember, this strong man. Obviously, the Americans have got some temptations in this respect too. And even in some of the discourse in this country about the strengths and weaknesses of the current prime minister, in the sense that at least he's a strong leader, that somehow makes you forgive other things. Is this idea of the need for a shepherd. And one of my hobby horses is the irony that when Israel looks back on David as its definitive leader, as it often does, even the King David Hotel in Jerusalem today, is playing into that. Are we looking back to the bloated person who turned into Goliath in the later part of his life, or are we looking back to the early David who just had the 5 smooth stones and didn't need anything else because he knew the countryside so well and actually was a shepherd? And was he a better shepherd when he just had sheep than he was when he controlled the whole country? And that's just in the first line. the Lord is, and just pronouncing the first line differently from the way we tend to. So it's very rewarding. I mean, obviously you can do that with the Lord's Prayer in the same way, and the Beatitudes and Ten Commandments in the same way. That they're the most familiar passages in the Bible, but they're well worth revisiting. Okay, shall we? Anything else on that one? Or are you happy to move on?
Just that, again, I'm sure lots of us preach on this at funerals, and what I often find myself focusing on to sort of surprise people out of the psalm is the line about "You spread a table before me in the presence of my enemies." This is a shepherd who guides us to the house of God, to a feast, to a table groaning with anointing, with all the good things. The enemies are around, but yet even in that we can find this great rejoicing and great feasting. And I think in these troubled times that might also be, I think that's a line that people often
Absolutely. That was actually the title of my talk at the Ukraine thing, because in a sense for me the absolute contrast in the face of Ukraine is that the invader is like the thief, and as I think John Milbank points out, that for Luther, the thief is the heretic, because the heretic believes there isn't enough for you and for me, and therefore I have to have yours. And that's obviously what Putin is saying by invading Ukraine. There's not enough for Russia; it's got to have Ukraine as well. Whereas the abundant table, the Babette's feast, if you like, that the psalm is setting out, is saying, Eucharistically, there is always more than enough, and there's always enough for you. So setting a table in the face of your enemies is actually contradicting the theological problem at the heart of enmity, which is that scarcity mindset that says there isn't enough for both of us. Whereas it's setting the table is saying there's actually more than enough for both of us. And that keys into the feeding the 5,000, that sense of the more you eat, the more there is to eat, the more you share, the more you find there's some for you. So, yeah, Good Shepherd Sunday, I guess. I've told many times, but I can't resist telling again, my favourite moment in 30 years of ministry came when I was doing a godly play presentation about precisely the passage you've described, and then the sheep were different colours, and I held up two of the sheep, and said, "I wonder whether it matters that the sheep are different colours of wood." And one of the 6-year-olds said, "It makes no difference. We should treat them all the same." And I thought, well, she's obviously been very well taught at diversity in her class at school, but I couldn't help wondering. I wonder what makes them all the same. And there was this really, really long pause. I did with adults and children together, until a little girl, just 6, 7 years old, at the back said, "They've all got the same shepherd."
Oh wow!
And that was just my greatest ever moment in ministry, because that was, Karl Barth would be up in heaven giving her a standing ovation for summing up his theology in just one short godly play phrase. So I couldn't resist sharing that. Okay, let's look at Ephesians.
Ephesians. I've looked at Revelation.
I'm sorry, Revelation. Why did I say Ephesians? Yeah, Revelation. Yes, you got it. Okay, so there is a great multitude. Revelation, not for the faint-hearted. This, I'm sure, is your favourite passage in Revelation. What would you want to say about this one?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it really fits with our theme, but just very as a side note, this is actually one of the passages that I point people to, and I wouldn't necessarily preach about this, but I point people to when they're struggling with the divinity of Christ, or particularly Muslim friends and colleagues who are saying, well, we can understand Jesus, the Son of God. We cannot cope with Jesus as God. And what you have in this picture, and I mean throughout Revelation, but particularly here, I think, is you've got the throne. We're in the throne room of heaven, and you have all these, if I may, all these kind of concentric circles of worship going on. So you've got the angels and the elders and the great multitudes, all tribes and nations, and they're all worshipping towards the throne. And on the throne you have God, and on the throne you have the Lamb, the one who looked like he had been slain. That's an earlier chapter. And that's one of the places that we get our sense of Christ at the heart of worship. And I can say to my Muslim friends, we all know that to worship anyone other than God is blasphemy, is idolatry. But here everyone is pointing their worship at this lamb. That's where we get this idea from. So that's kind of my theological side note to this passage, which may or may not be what you want to preach about this Sunday. But something about just going back to Revelation, which of course people find very challenging. But this being a love letter to the church under terrible, violent persecution, and this picture of all those loved ones who are the people in white are the martyrs, those who have died for their faith, and who are now wearing the white garments, like the baptismal robes. In my church, lots of people turn up on Easter Sunday wearing white head to toe. Just what kind of hope and encouragement that brings to people literally under fire. Again, that just seems to speak really, really powerfully into our, all the stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I like to pick out of a passage like this a single phrase, and I think for me the one that stands out is, "They will hunger no more, and thirst no more." If you want to add thirst no more, and I can well imagine constructing a sermon, around hunger, but obviously once you've got hunger and thirst together, you've obviously got something quite Eucharistic there, and to see the Eucharist as the anticipation of this moment. I think for like community like yours, an Anglo-Catholic community that's shaped around the table, I think can be quite inspiring for people to see that. I can certainly imagine preaching a sermon called "It Is Actually," which started with the phrase "Life isn't a rehearsal," and then said, concluded with the fact that it's a rehearsal for this moment. That the Eucharist is our rehearsal for this, pinnacle moment, if you like, in Revelation. So
it is our rehearsal, and yet we are also already participating in that moment. Where we had 7 First Communions on Easter Day, and one of the things I've taught them is from an earlier passage in Revelation. Everyone in the throne room a couple of chapters earlier is bowing, saying, "Holy, holy, holy." When we're here bowing, we're joining in with their "Holy, holy, holy" around this table. So we have that great sense of rehearsing, getting a foretaste of the table, but also somehow being in there. We get taken into the room while it's actually happening.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, we've got a humdinger of a gospel here. You mentioned your concern about Muslims. I mean, it's fair to say John 10 verse 30 is perhaps Jesus's boldest claim in any of the 4 Gospels. I and the Father are one. Not a lot of Muslims would swallow that down without it touching the sides a little bit. So it kind of is about sheep. It's like, okay, this is the third of the Good Shepherd Sundays, and what sheep bits have we got left in John's Gospel? It feels a bit like that. To me, there is one line that steps out. I've preached on it before. I'm going to preach on it again this Sunday because it's just, to me, such a profound line. No one will snatch them out of my hand. I just can't, as a deathbed gospel, nothing, and the fact that it's repeated. No one will take them out of my hand. No one can snatch them out of the Father's hand. That sense of conviction, or existential conviction that we are held in the hands of God. Nothing can take us out. I find that word "snatch" really interesting. It's such a playground child, thing you tell children off for not and tell them not to do. Um, I tried to do a bit of work chasing it up in the Greek, but it didn't get me anywhere. It didn't take me to anywhere interesting, so it doesn't appear in the sermon. But I just personally, I find that those words so affecting. What are your thoughts about? I think I mean one other thing before asking you your thoughts is I had to. One thing that I'd clearly forgotten reading this passage is I think I was assumed that John 10, okay, my New Testament professor says it's a collection and it's all sorts of bits thrown together in the way that New Testament professors like to say. But this says um, it was the festival of the dedication, and he was in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and I'd always thought he was sitting in the fields talking about the Good Shepherd. I'd never quite imagined him being in Jerusalem in winter, talking about that kind of threw me. So I did what all preachers do when they find a bit that throws them. They just completely ignored it. I've just passed over that. I don't know what to do with that. But tell me a bit about your thoughts about this powerful part of John 10.
Well, actually, at this stage in the week, I'm still absorbing it because it like you say, it's such a humdinger of a gospel. I think that's incredibly powerful. The line that you choose, I think the my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. Is probably why we've got this bit on vocation today.
Yeah.
But again, that we are known, that we are. The work is not all on us. That we are known and loved and called and redeemed. God is doing that. The shepherd is doing that work for us, and that we are being held, even when we don't know it, or we're not sure that we are, or we don't really believe that we are. Just so powerful. And then moving into that kind of punchline at the end. No one will snatch them. We're safe, even though we don't think we're safe, and we don't know that we are.
So I talk a lot about the difference between epic and lyric, and the epic being the broad canvas and the theological issues about eternal salvation and whether it's universal and whether there's a delay between our death and eternal life, and those sort of epic things, and then the more lyric things, which is what does it feel to be snatched out of your parents' hand, those kind of things. And to me, a good sermon. Well, obviously, I got the idea from von Balthasar. Really, it's not really me, but with a bit of help from Ben Quash, I would have to acknowledge. But that it's the interplay. What Balthasar calls the dramatic, or the interplay of that epic and lyric that really make the gospel, that make the Bible, and to me make great preaching. And that, in my experience, a lot of preachers stick to one or the other. They'll either do the epic and make their comments about items in the news as if they were writing an editorial or op-ed for a major newspaper or something, or they'll be very lyric and talk about what it was like to be with someone at their deathbed and how they managed to find the right words and amen kind of thing, without going into all the kind of issues that the congregation may be thinking, saying, hang on, well, what about other faiths? And I think the skill is mainly to in the interplay between the two. Which way would you be landing in terms of preaching on this? Would you be going with that very tender "nothing can snatch," or the much more epic "I and the Father are one" Trinitarian doctrine?
I think given where I think I am, which is tired, as lots of us are, and where I think people are, I'm more likely to go with the lyric pastoral. I'm not saying I do that every time, but I think we're still needing to hear so many people have said to me in the last month or so about how they're only just beginning to realize the impact of the pandemic on everything. I have a lawyer friend who said, work's really hard at the moment. People in the city are making crazy decisions and acting really erratically and irrationally. We're just sort of coming out of this craziness. And so I think for me, that's probably the way that I would go this time. But
Mm.
we'll see. It's only Tuesday.
And going back to the things we were talking about at the beginning in terms of Ukraine and Easter, um, if one of the other difficult things to balance is, are you always preaching on a text? What are your thoughts about, sometimes you sort of, a bit like a speaker saying, these are my prepared remarks, but I'm so moved to see all of you in front of me, I'm going to say something else, in a kind of gesture. Are there times when you say, well, actually, I'm not going to preach on these texts. I'm actually going to talk from the heart or to the very basics of the gospel, and I'm not going to tie myself to whatever passage of Revelation we might happy to give us some reflections on that balance.
I think that's such a great question. Normally, week in, week out, I'm a lectionary preacher, and we'll find one of the texts to focus on, even though I will, might refer to others. But there have definitely been times when, sometimes even practically climbing into the pulpit, I've gone, oh, that's not the right sermon. There's going to be a different sermon, and I'm just going to have to trust God that that's going to come out. In my experience, though, they haven't, well, for me anyway, they don't tend to be in response to major world events. I was listening in on your conversation with Sally the week or so before, when we knew that Putin was about to invade Ukraine, and you had a great discussion about precisely, this, do you kind of ditch it and respond to what's going on around you? And for me, I think I kind of go back to some of the great teaching that I had at Yale, which is one is Tom Trogue's maxim: today you may preach one sermon and only one sermon. And secondly, for me, what is the sermon that this congregation needs to hear today? And it's not always going to be the one about what's in the news. I think for me, the times when I have ditched what I'm doing and gone with something completely different, whether that's as I'm climbing the pulpit or a few days earlier, have been when there's something that is really the most important thing that they are thinking about that Sunday. So maybe there's been a tragedy in our community, or something that has really, something, we sadly are in an area of very high knife crime. So we, something that had affected a congregation's family member. That's the kind of time when I will am more likely to go off piste. The kind of the bigger sort of world events, I'm more likely to reflect on over time in my preaching. I think, but for me, the key is what is the sermon that these people really need to hear, not what I think I maybe ought to be preaching about. The kind of oughts, OUGHTH, the oughts in ministry can just be really crushing for us as preachers. Oh, I'm sure everybody's preaching about, I don't know, we've got elections this week in the UK. Maybe everyone's preaching about the elections. Well, maybe that's not what these people need to hear. What's the sermon God wants them to hear? Yeah.
So Kate is very keen that you don't recommend any of my books, but keen that you do recommend others, particularly preaching in general. But I think probably John's Gospel, for example, and Revelation, a bit more niche. Acts. Any sources you found particularly helpful?
Definitely. Well, I use. I'm a big fan of the series that Barbara Brown Taylor has edited, Feasting on the Word, which is an epic 12-volume series of commentaries that you can probably see on my bookshelf, because that has 4 commentaries for every reading set for the Sunday. So, for example, on the Revelation reading, there'll be a theological commentary, an exegetical commentary, a pastoral commentary, and a homiletical commentary. So that, it takes a lot of space on your bookshelf, but that is a bit of a goldmine. I think the ones that I've been, going to in specifically in response to this, I have a really nice book on Revelation by Richard Borkham, New Testament scholar. I don't know if that's coming up right on your screen. Part of the New Testament, Cambridge University Press New Testament Theology series, but also John's Gospel. I have an amazing secondhand commentary by Leslie Newbegin, who was a missionary in India, and he brings together so helpfully kind of Indian, Hindu religion, faith, and philosophy, and John's Gospel in a very Christian, in a way that I find very helpful. Anyway, so yeah, those are my top three recommendations, I think.
That's really, really helpful. Now, I'll be told off if I don't mention that in partnership with Canterbury Press, I'll be doing an online launch for my new book, already mentioned, Humbler Faith, Bigger God, and that's coming up in a couple of Thursdays' time. So the best way to access it, I think, is probably to go on the Canterbury Press website and to follow links. Conversation a bit like this one. Oops. Can you still see me? Because my screen's gone blank.
I can hear you. I think we're freezing a bit. I can hear you.
My whole
Oh,
screen has disappeared.
You're fine. You're on.
My back? Okay. Okay, that's good. Well, thanks for that. That was a little bit alarming. I can't remember the last time that happened, not with this computer anyway. So that's coming up. I'm just checking the date. That is coming up on the 12th of May at 6 o'clock. We'll plug it again at this time next week. And just for an hour. So if Tom Holland will be in conversation, Tom Holland, author of many wonderful books, including a particularly wonderful book called Dominion, that influenced my writing, hence him being the conversation partner. So people are very welcome to join that conversation if they'd like to. Ellen, on behalf of all, huge thanks to you. I hope we get to do this again. You've been a wonderful, wonderful guest, and I hope this has been an introduction for many people to your own work. Anything of your publication or active ministry you'd like to mention that people might be able to learn more about you?
Gosh, well, thank you. Well, firstly, thank you. It's been a real honour and a great joy, and really helpful for my own sermon preparation this week. I tend to sometimes I don't have anything published, because actually what I love is listening to sermons and helping teach about sermons, but sometimes I do things through St. Augustine's, and I'm hoping the Festival of Preaching might invite me back again, so we'll
Good.
And I'd just love to say hello to Keith, who said hello, who I haven't seen for a decade, since I was a kid. Hello,
that's marvellous. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks very much, Alan. Sally will be back with me next week, and do look on the Heart Edge website for other events taking place through Heart Edge. Thanks to our partners at Canterbury Press, and look forward to seeing everybody again very soon, and happy preaching.